Good afternoon, everybody. What you don't see is that there's a mirror on this side of the column. So everybody who stands here gets to stare at themselves as they're presenting. So it's very disconcerting, I have to say. So welcome, everybody. Thank you all for joining us today. I want to begin by thanking the organizers of the Centennial event, Mark Goldthorpe, and in particular Amy Murphy, who's hiding in the back of the room, who invited me to convene this panel. And let me begin by introducing myself very briefly. My name is Ingalill Wahlroos-Ritter. I'm an architect. I'm an educator as well. And I specialize in the building envelope and the use of glass, the experimental use of glass in architecture. I'm currently the graduate chair in the School of Architecture at Woodbury University, and my former teaching experiences include Yale University, SciArc, the Bartlett and Cornell University. I've been at Woodbury now for 6 wonderful years. My partner, Roland, and I established our joint practice, Rhode, in London, and we're currently working in Los Angeles on a number of projects. So, to begin, the theme of this conference is, of course, digital aptitudes and the profound impact that digital technologies have had on the discipline of architecture. As Mark and Amy write in their overview, quote, "The ability to process and share massive amounts of information has clearly opened entirely new opportunities for research and praxis that radically exceed empirical methods and previously held notions of space and time. The questions that Amy and Mark pose in their overview refer to the ubiquitousness and inevitability of computational tools, which can be interpreted as having ultimately beneficial effects on the discipline of architecture. I would like this panel to interpret their theme in another way. The work of these panelists engage with a number of digital technologies, computational tools that are generative and representational, communication management systems, web-based technologies, building systems and performance modeling technologies, fabrication tools, and new material technologies. But consider, who designs these tools? Who determines the use of these tools? Who deploys these tools? And ultimately, who are the beneficiaries of these tools? The underlining theme of this panel is that digital technologies and computational technologies, when deployed as they have been intended, in fact exclude. But rather than lament the fact that computational tools and their associated communication capacities have in fact increased the exclusivity of the users of these tools, namely architects, I'd like to posit that the real intelligence that these tools engender are not those of intentional deployment and whole-scale adoption. In fact, the real intelligence derives from the misuse, the hacking, retooling, and reappropriation of these exclusive technologies as they're applied to questions outside of the assumed problematics. The results of this misuse are a consequent and startling inclusivity. So the panelists have been asked to present work that identifies boundaries of exclusion, be they gender, socioeconomic, or cultural, and suggest ways in which technology can act as a transgressive medium. So I'd like to, first of all, thank you to the panelists for taking the time to present their thoughts and work. I've asked each one of them to make a 5-minute presentation, and after which I hope we'll have time for questions. You're all chuckling. So I'd like to begin by asking Hansy Barraza to present to begin. She's an architect and an associate professor of architecture at the Rhode Island School of Design. In 2011, she co-founded BRACE, Building Research Architecture Community Exchange, a 501 nonprofit dedicated to creating new community spaces. When she's not working at Studio Luz Architects, the firm she co-founded with Anthony Piermarini, Hansy is playing soccer with her soccer teammates, the Thunderbolts. Please join me in welcoming Hansy.
Thank you, Ingalill. Let's see. Let's see if I can stick to 5 minutes. There's this famous representation of South America by the Uruguayan modernist Joaquin Torres Garcia
The upside-down map, which he drew in 1943, it's one of his simplest kind of maps that attempts to reframe worldview of South America as an important continent, placing South Pole at the top of the earth. Torres Garcia was interested in presenting South America as a modernist school of the South, a place of experimentation similar to what was happening at that time, places like in Paris and in New York. In seeking for alternative ways in which technology can be learned and accessed as a means to expand the impact of our discipline, I am reminded of Torres Garcia's drawing of South America. In this presentation, I would like to offer 3 thoughts on technology and architecture that has inspired the work of Studio Luz. The first being that one should not channel technology from developed to developing sectors. I have observed that many buildings, technologies, and ideas have been transported from the north to the south and imposed on the developing world. Instead, reverse the usual flow of power and ideas. There is much value architects can learn from people who have been ignored by mainstream authorities. Take, for example, the Wayuu community, a semi-nomadic indigenous community in the Guajira Peninsula of Colombia, bordering Venezuela. They have different nodal structures for eating, sleeping, bathing, communing. Their structures are woven from the dry cactus hearts. Structures are open and social, the most enclosed being their sleeping quarters, which is only used at night for sleeping, which as you see down here, which is completely enclosed. Their structure is built to reflect their way of life. Take, for example, how the Wayúus weave their chinchorros, which is very similar to the hammock. They use the structure for their building, columns and beams, as looms. The Wayuu inspired me, and I borrowed the same technology they used for the Big Hammock project. The structure was the loom itself. Once the hammock was woven on site, the loom bars were removed from the structure, and it became the spreader bar, independent from the structure. For the Wayuu, identity is inherently embedded within their structures, which brings me to my second point. That is, technology is only meaningful to the culture in which it operates. Let's take the Wikipedia definition of technology. Technology is the making, the creation of or usage of tools and techniques to solve problems. Martin Heidegger provides a broader context to technology when he studied the hammer. It is only when something goes wrong, the hammer is broken, that makes us aware of the object at work, what Heidegger calls being in the world. Technology, thus, is interconnected to purposefulness. The existence of hammers and doorknobs only has any purposefulness and meaning in the social context of wood, construction, and homes. The spreader bar and shuttle were tools we had to make to weave a large hammock on site. Its presence on site for 4 days made people aware not only the labor invested, but the craft required in weaving. It also made people aware of the potential of the site of the Greenway here in Boston as a richer public space for leisure. It negotiated the formality, scale, and distance of that space such that people could engage with each other in a neighborly and friendly way. It brought people together in close proximity so that people can strive conversations. One can stretch the interpretation of the hammock as a physical manifestation of our social networks. The program was geared towards inclusiveness. It provides a social ground where strangers can come together to share their own personal identity and experiences. Our culture experiences and our identity shape how we think and produce architecture. I'm Colombian. I'm descendant of 3 different races, Black, Indian, and white. In the United States, I'm Hispanic, or at times when I want to emphasize my gender, I say I'm Latina. I live in 2 worlds between Colombia and the US. and linked to those two places through the web. Linking the global and to the local was an opportunity where my culture, my identity, my ethnicity, and my race could be explored and shared with others, physically. The object itself didn't speak on issues of race and identity, but provides a space in the city that broke boundaries, avoided classification, and created community through the shared interests of relaxation and conversation. How does technology rethink and shape our relationship to cultural identity and architecture? Nancy Burson's app comes to mind in answering this question. In the development of an app, Nancy Burson uses technology to explore issues of personal identity, to discuss issues of race and ethnicity. The downloadable app allowed the user to choose any identity they wanted to become. It was simple: choose any race, white, Middle Eastern, Black, Hispanic, or Asian. As a social tool, the artist uses technology to rethink and shape our relationship to cultural identity and place. She created an accessible, downloadable app so that one can step outside oneself and understand what it was like to become someone else and to move on beyond our differences. How do I create an identity for the hammock where multiple identities can be projected? Depending on their rearrangement of color, it displays national identity. For the Big Hammock project, we assembled the colors in a loose way so that multiple identities can have a cultural association with the hammock. Colombians thought the hammock was representing their country. Americans thought that the American flag was projected. But looking upon it more closely, at the color sequence, it didn't fit either category. It was an in-between site that reflected the spaces I occupy, being Colombian race in America. With this experience, I show you my third point. Technology can help create a subjective identity and therefore allows us to access multiple modes of expression. It is interesting to me that the hammock was a manual project supported by the whole digital network, from the Awesome Foundation via Twitter to Kickstarter to Facebook, which allowed for funding as well, raised awareness. As architects, we're constantly searching for new ways to make and produce meaningful work. Our offices searches for that authentic production, most often beginning with a reflection of one's identity and using digital technology to fabricate a sense of craft in the work. Here are handmade doorknobs, nipple tables, light gates, and surfaces that go beyond white walls. Thank you.
Thank you. 7 minutes. 7. Our next presenter is Jon Stewart, an architect, historian, and chair of the Department of Architecture at Florida International University. He develops collaborative research projects on complexity, community, technology, the environment, and public space. His books include The Gray Cloth, Paul Scherbart's novel on glass architecture with MIT Press, Eli Jacques Kahn, Architect, Beaux-Arts to Modernism in New York with W.W. Norton Press, and The New Deal in South Florida, Design, Policy, and Community Building, 1933 to 1940 with the University Press of Florida. He was editor of the Journal of Architecture Education issue on gender and architecture. His research has been funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Graham Foundation, and the Van Allen Institute in New York City. Please join me in welcoming Jon.
Thank you very much, Ingalill, and thank you all for coming. Let's see if I can negotiate this. Escape. I'm a Mac person, so this is this is old territory. Let's see. Oh, I see. So I'm going to present one project today that has taken many years of work and elaboration, and it's something that kind of grows out of the 18 years now that I've been teaching in Miami at a school at the university that graduates more Hispanic students than any other university in the nation. And it's been a challenging and interesting experience, and one that really kind of has helped me to visualize head-on issues of identity and class and other kind of social mobility and technology. So this is a project then that I took from its initial stages as an ideas project into kind of fabricating a model and prototypes for it, and working on it with collaborators at Museum of Modern Art and in a high school in Lima, Peru. And one of the initial kind of motivations for looking at this project was Nicholas Negroponte's One Laptop Per Child initiative, and the idea that each child needs a single laptop, and the technology is essentially an individual kind of question. And I really wanted to kind of draw that into a new, kind of fundamentally analyze that question, to see if technology really could serve the public and could serve public space, and whether or not there was a way in which the one laptop per child could become something that was an open communication device for people in public places, so that initiatives of social change, awareness of social injustices, awareness of economic and environmental issues could be brought out, instead of from scientists at the top, could be kind of exchanged and discussed by people in an everyday setting. The idea was that you'd be stopping at a bus stop, and you'd see somebody else at a bus stop that had one of these. It's not a laptop anymore, but some kind of projection, kind of a Skype-like projection, that you'd start to talk to that person about the things that you were, kind of the differences in your daily lives, as your lives were in a single. And we realized that for this to work, lives had to be kind of coordinated along certain rhythms. There couldn't be somebody in China talking with somebody in the United States. It had to kind of be real time. So therefore the name time zone. And we started to look at how time zones would be, first of all, just the Eastern time zone that I'm in, where it extends up to a colony of Denmark in the north, down to Lima, Peru in the south. And so we set up our initial kind of project for this between Lima and New York City. And it was going to be and the Van Allen was really the instrumental component of this. And our initial kind of idea was that this would be inflatable, kind of inflatable pods that could have various different, you could see this in here, and that's in Thule up in up in the far north. But you'd be able to start this interaction on city streets. You'd be able to continue this action on city streets that starts really in schoolyards. And we thought, kids at school get out, they have lunch at the same time, they're in playgrounds at the same time, and that this would be a way for them to start to develop, instead of one laptop per child, that they would be able to kind of communicate across with each other, play games, learn about each other's lives through language, kind of language games that we kind of invented for them and we're starting to show here. And that these would be ways to create a lifelong relationship to technology that would be other than their phone and FaceTime on the phone or their laptop and and they would start to expect these to happen in other places. Now, very naively, we thought this could be the way it could work, which is impossible. And you inflate this thing, and how do you get? So the challenge was really to say, okay, the idea was that it's an inflatable kind of beach ball with a projector in it, and it goes into a public place. And how does it not like pop in the schoolyard? How does a kid not like pop it immediately? How do car runs into it, it's like gone. How do we make it durable? And if we start thinking about this in the sense that these pods pile up and kind of become public monuments, and they become places that people expect to get information, like our public monuments that we tend not to read, the Civil War monuments, the other things but they have a durability to them. Public monuments must last in the public. So we thought about how these might be organized. These are some other images of the kind of activities that could take place in here, and it was just post 9/11 when I was starting to think about this. So there was all kind of this question about how grieving might take place along a large sector of populations around the world. And these are some other images of these pods as they were landing. Now, when I had to build 2 pods, then I was working with a team of students at Columbia and a team of students at FIU, and we immediately had to question the flexibility and the inflatability. So we started to look at ways in which these pods might be extremely durable, and looked at, it turned out that we ended up with thinking about corian. We went kind of from the granite of the public monument to the granite countertop, and thinking about these relationships between the durable materials that we have in our lives, the public and the private. And likewise, corian is a durable countertop material that then we started to look at how this new corian is translucent might be used to create to create these kind of pods in this way. And the other kind of delicious thing about corian was that it was DuPont makes corian, and DuPont made their money on gunpowder, and this was kind of like our whole thing was like, let's create social justice and not have people talk instead of fighting each other. And so we did, though, without expressing that so clearly to DuPont, get them to donate the corian that we needed to start making this. Trying to figure out how we would, what? I'm at 7 minutes? No way. Oh, you are amazing. I can't believe you did that so fast. Okay, so I'm almost finished. Anyway, is that you doing the beeping? Okay. Like, that's a good trick. I should learn that one. So, sorry. These things, so we started to test these. Obviously, we kind of composed it. And then we brought them to Lima and to students in New York. And I just want to say that the exact opposite of what we expect. This is a whole series of kind of mistakes and misuses. And for example, the kids in Lima ended up being those who had traveled all over the world and had seen everything. And they were like, oh, when I go skiing in Austria, I do this. And the kids in New York were like, I've never left New York. They were like the talented kids in New York. So the balance, it was really very interesting on who the social groups were that were starting to use these, what they talked about, the music. And the project became a kind of a collection or a taxonomy of these dialogues that the students who just had no agenda actually just started talking to each other what they did. And this is kind of an image of the project when it came back to Van Allen. And there's a couple of images of this kind of new project and how it might look, and how it might be used as furniture and as this new type of public monument. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Thank you, John. So, bachelor number 2. Eric Höweler, born in Colombia, another Colombian, principal at Höweler and Yoon Architecture, a multidisciplinary practice operating in the space between architecture, art, and landscape. He received a Bachelor of Architecture and a Master's of Architecture from Cornell University. He's currently an assistant professor in architecture at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Prior to forming Höweler and Yoon Architecture, Eric was a senior designer at Diller Scofidio and an associate principal at Cohn Peterson Fox Associates. He's the co-author of Expanded Practice, Höweler and Yoon Architecture, MY Studio, Princeton Architectural Press publication from 2009, and author of Skyscraper, Vertical Now, Rizzoli publication from 2003. Please join me in welcoming Eric.
Thanks, Ingalill. I probably have way too many slides, so I'm just going to jump around a little bit. The brief was sort of thinking about technology, the body, social norms, habits, and I was looking at some of the work that we'd done and realized that sort of the body had been sort of present in so many of our projects as a kind of initial kind of site as a young architect. So thinking about the body in the representation on the left as a kind of series of fields, maybe energy fields, and then the image on the right, a kind of more Western idea of the body as a kind of metric, as a kind of measuring device. We're inspired by earth art and people that sort of were using the body, in this case, as a measuring device in landscape. So understanding the landscape, understanding the city through the body We're also interested in sort of the body as it's deployed in space, how it occupies space, how it takes up space, how it defines space. The body as a the kind of the efficiencies of the body and the kind of spaces that it defines is tied up with issues of technology, but also issues of gender. One of the first projects that sort of launched our interest in our office, our interest in technology, was a project that was done by my wife, Mi-Jin Yoon. She was taking a class at MIT. As a faculty member, you're allowed to take classes at MIT as long as you get a B or higher. So she took this class, and she was sort of, we're trained as architects, but she was immediately sort of confronted with all these technologies that are available, but at MIT they're treated not as exotic. They're somehow available and not threatening. So she was interested in designing a dress that would define her sort of personal space. She called it the defensible dress, and it went through several versions of it. We fabricated it several times, and we used very simple technology. This is a microcontroller, there's an IR sensor, and there's an LED light just to sort of indicate when it's been triggered. So this is something that we built, tested. And in the different versions, we used different technologies. Initially, it was a servo motor. These are actually using a nitinol wire, which is a smart material. It's as an electrical charge goes through it, it contracts. So the kind of the contraction sort of lifts the quill up. So this project was an early project that dealt with the body in space, technology as a kind of prosthetic, as a way to sort of define space. And we argue that this is architecture. Architecture is about defining these spaces within sort of norms. So these are the working drawings. These are the nitinol wires sort of running over the hinges, and that's the detail. That's the wire itself. So this project is a kind of initial sort of intimate scaled architecture, which we worked, with the techniques of a seamstress, the techniques of a kind of electrical engineer. Sort of launched our interest in the kind of larger or potentially urban applications for this. We did an early project in 2004 for the Athens Olympics, where we conceived of a field of fiber optics that would invite people to sort of immerse themselves in this field. And as they sort of walk through the field, they would sort of trigger a number of sensors, and the sensors would emit, or the fiber optics would emit white light, and some speakers would emit white noise. And so this created a space in the city that you could immerse yourself in, and the white noise, in a way, created a kind of boundary. It sort of masked the sounds of the city. And so this was sort of technology that came out of the dress, but it evolved at the scale of the city. And this project sort of launched a number of other projects that allowed us to think about technology not as something inaccessible or exotic, but something that we could actually, more of a kind of DIY type of project. We were also impressed by the way people use the space. They kind of invented ways to engage with a very simple idea, just vertical fibers. They invented games and sort of were playing games and engaging not just with the piece but with each other. So that's something that we sort of have been sort of pushing and developing further. We're trying different technologies. I'm going to show one more project and then I'll stop. This project was installed in Philadelphia, again using sensors, using wireless technology, trying to bring people together, trying to bring people to different parts of the city and interact with each other. So this is something we did last year in Philadelphia. We call it Light Drift. The brief was to bring people to the waterfront, and the idea was that the waterfront, while it had been sort of central to the development of Philadelphia, had sort of become a kind of blind spot in the city. People didn't acknowledge the waterfront. They were disengaged from it. So how do you bring people back to a kind of resource, a kind of original infrastructure for the city? We thought we could create a grid of lights that would extend from the edge of the water into the river, and that people sitting here would be able to activate and control a series of orbs that were floating in the river. And if they were to team up, they could actually create patterns in the river together, in a way encouraging them to sort of design, in a way, the kind of matrix of lights, the kind of screen in the river. So we looked at wireless transmitters in the pods. We had a series of pods in the river with wireless receivers. We sort of prototyped these pieces used some digital tools, prototyped, tested, calculated, buoyancy, tested, installed with kayaks in the river. And the idea was, as you approached it, the sort of normative state was green. As you approached it, we call it a kind of seduction mode. It would sort of flicker between green and blue. And as you sat on it, then it would go to solid blue. And it really, this was up only for a few days, but it really sort of drew people to the river. We were sort of amazed by the interest in the piece. People were trying to figure out how it worked. They sort of teamed up with their friends to try to figure out how the pattern worked. And I'm just gonna, whoops. Hopefully I'll play a short video that was made. We didn't make this, it was a sort of documentary. And maybe I'll stop with that. So maybe just a couple of thoughts. For us, digital tools are not exotic. They're kind of, we say we've ingested them. We've sort of, they've become normative practice. We don't even talk about them anymore. We do think technology in general has a kind of exotic quality that's intimidating. We think it can be made very accessible, making people interact with these things somehow de-exoticizes them. We are interested in urban spaces and the kind of playful environments that they can create, and play as a means to sort of bring people together, get them to interact with each other. And in a way, we don't consider material and media to be separate. They're actually the same thing. They're part of the kind of repertoire of architectural elements that we try to use in these projects. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker, Dr. Paulette Singley, is a professor in the School of Architecture at Woodbury University in Los Angeles, California, my colleague. She co-edited Eating Architecture and in Fashion, and she co-edited Eating Architecture and Architecture in Fashion, 2 different books, and has been published in Log, Any, Assemblage, and several architectural anthologies. She received a PhD in Architectural History and Theory from Princeton University, an MA in the History of Architecture and Urbanism from Cornell University, and a B.Arch from University of Southern California. Paulette is the director of the Rome Center for Architecture and Culture, an educational research and outreach center with a focus on architecture in response to cultural context, the archaeological unconscious, and the generative lenses of history and theory. Please join me in welcoming Paulette. Some help here.
Yeah, so you're just gonna...
Do you know what it's called?
No, you renamed it with my name on
I
it.
know, Singley. Is it Singley?
I don't know where it is. I can't see a damn thing.
Oh, here it is. Singley.
click here. I'm the Luddite of the group. Where? Here? Okay, good. All right. It would seem, to a certain extent, that we need to dust off some old texts before beginning to interrogate the provocation this panel proffers by invoking Donna Haraway's 1991 publication, Simians, Cyborgs, and Women. That in order to initiate a discussion of difference in 2012, we need to reenact a discussion initiated and repressed about 2 decades ago. So metaphorically, I'm taking out the book and dusting it off. This did not do it. Yikes, I can't operate this machine. This one? Got it, thank you, this one. 2 potential axes in the coupling of technology and the construction of difference are that, number 1, technology will empower diverse practices, or number 2, it will reify already existing power structures, and then shades of gray in between these 2 axes. This having been said, in what follows I will rehearse the means by which technology couples with female identity as an opposite of and complement to the title of Bachelors, Brides, and Open Source Machines through the figure of spinsters, women who have passed a proper marriageable age, but who weave and spin stories, virgins, symbols of purity and protein energy, and digital dolls, those Hollywood women who have reclaimed space in a phallogocentric universe through dissimulation, ventriloquism, prosthetics, and surrogacy. If we understand an avatar to be a computer that has been humanized and a cyborg to be a human that has been computerized, then at the crossing of the 2 hybrid bodies, we find the chiasmus of alternative identities, the merging of the body and machine, so redolent in canonical modernism, in which fetishism and eroticism of mechanomorphic devices anticipate this current discussion of technology's role to empower, to enslave, to liberate, or just to confuse. The title of Bachelors here references Marcel Duchamp's 1913 installation piece, The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelor's Even, later expanded by Michel Carouge in the 1950s into analysis of Franz Kafka's story in the penal colony. In the Franz Kafka story, there's a machine that punishes people who've committed a crime by having the penalty by people who are placed into a bed, and the penalty of the crime is etched onto the prisoner's back, the words over and over and over being etched into the back until the prisoner understands internally what the punishment was and then expires. Carouge constructs Duchamp's and Kafka's bachelor machine as an apparatus that produces celibacy and death. We might reference Comte Villiers' Deal Adam from Tomorrow's Eve of 1886 as an instrument of such desire, as well as having popularized the term android, that in a book that imagines Thomas Edison as having constructed the perfect woman, an automaton whose every action, particularly her ability to speak, is controlled by male scripts. The bachelor machine, then, is not just about death and celibacy, but also about a specific type of eroticized mechanism that Filippo Tommaso Marinetti personifies in his 1909 Futurist Manifesto, where the body merges with the machine in an archetypal car accident, where he talks about the breast of his Sudanese nurse and the car piercing him like a violin instrument, that he developed into his own brand of autoeroticism. That was a joke. Surrealist artists such as Max Ernst and Hans Bellmer explored the design mechanism of a prosthetic and mechanomorphic female eroticism, in which the merging of technology and the human body figured on the female torso, with certain misogynistic representation systems of slicing and cutting the body into pieces. Haraway develops the cyborg metaphor to explain how fundamental contradictions in feminist theory and identity should be cojoined as a site of liberation. But while she posits the cyborg as a creature in a, and I quote, post-gender world that has no, quote, truck with bisexuality, pre-Oedipal symbiosis, unalienated labor, other seductions to organic wholeness, Haraway's argument for empowerment through affinities instead of identities leaves us powerless to resist the reductive imagery of idealized machined females. Thus, where Sigourney Weaver, posing as Ripley in Aliens, appears as a cyborg, manipulating the dock lifter into a suit of armor, a hypertrophy of musculature and cunning, the figure of Sim 1 represents the atrophy of female power, a body spoken through a male voice, through male desires. Surrogacy, ventriloquism, marionette theater, counterposed against empowerment, musculature, and the ability to take it like a man, nevertheless, both result in the automaton with the perky breasts and tight ass, as displayed through popular media. One project here suggests Haraway's cyborg produces an alternative path to the resolute condition of the desiring machine. Doris Sung and Ingalill Wahlroos-Ritter architects, in a blatant reference to a great colleague and great colleagues who are here, working with Matthew Melnick, built Bloom, an installation made of thermo-bimetal that responds to the sun by curling and gesticulating. It also is an ornament, a structure, and a machine of torture, a female bachelor machine. Thus it is that while we may develop the bachelor machine into a hybrid identity of spinsters, virgins, and digital dolls to describe the field of inquiry through which we negotiate the coupling of technology, body politics, and resistance to hegemonic structures, we turn to the cyborg as a problematized as well as seductive image of the technological body.
Thank you. That's a wonderful image to end on. Our next speaker is Javier Quintana de Uña. He holds a master's degree in advanced architectural design from Columbia University, not Columbia, in New York, and a PhD in architecture from the University of Navarra in Spain. Since 2007, he has served as Dean of IE School of Architecture and Design, an international and innovative school within IE University in Segovia and Madrid. Quintana de Uña is advancing a new and professionally oriented model of architectural education based on technological and content innovation and the merger of design with management. Design Intelligence has listed the school as first of the hidden gems of global architectural education and identified it as an unexpected option. Quintana de Uña also maintains a successful architectural practice in his role as founding partner of TBA, the Taller Básico de Arquitectura in Spain. The firm has completed numerous projects and has won a range of prizes and distinctions for their work. Please join me in welcoming Javier to present.
Thank you for the talent. That was nice. Okay, initially I was not included in this panel, but then Ingalill saw that I was attending the conference because I was participating in this pre-conference symposium on the influence of online education in general, and of course in architectural education. And well, we made kind of a deal that I was going to retool that presentation. But that's me, I'm sorry. Sorry. So I could, well, actually, then it's not me. Then it's not me. That's strange. No. Well, technology. Anyhow, I was trying to, the intention here is that, or the deal was to add another layer to the discussion, but more an institutional layer, let's say. Try to find out which would be the consequence of the use of technologies, digital technologies, in schools of architecture, meaning that what is the impact, what is the new model of schools of architecture that would be the consequence of a massive use of digital tools in education. Certainly I don't have the answer to that, but I have some thoughts that I would like to share with you. I especially then will focus a bit of what is online education and how this is affecting in the present state of education in general and in architecture. From my point of view, what I can say about architectural education in regarding technology, I think that bringing the digital realm in a massive scale is changing definitely the concept of what a school of architecture should be. I think it allows us to be global, to be 24/7, to, if we use also online education, to enhance the face-to-face experience. Consequence of that is, for example, that people are allowed to work while they study, or they study while they work. Two thoughts. First, that, and I don't know if we are aware, because this is a place where the digital seems to be really advanced, or in this conference I've seen so many interesting things. But my feeling, at least, statistics say that in other disciplines like engineering, biology, or even business, the incorporation of technology in education, it's even deeper than the one we have here. So again, the question is, are we really rethinking the concept of schools of architecture out of the inclusion on all of these experiments, all of this exercise that we're seeing today here? Well, I really don't know. Second thought I wanted to say, I think we're late, but not only that, is that I think if I use the terminology of someone called Mark Pretsky, that I don't know if you're familiar with, is a Yale graduate that speaks about the impact of digital culture in our lives. He describes that there's two types of people, the natives and the immigrants. An immigrant would be the one that prints an email instead of reading out of the screen, or someone who will call you to say, did you get my email, instead of writing you an email. So there's two different types of culture there. I'm definitely an immigrant, okay, in that sense. And my question here is that no matter how many native professors we have in our schools of architecture at this point, my feeling is that institutionally, schools of architecture behave as immigrants. That was like introduction. Well, I thought I had changed this. Well, my first experience in the digital realm was in 1992 at Columbia University. I was one of the first students that had to join the paperless studios, which was, in the time of Bernard Tsumi there, which was a really great experience. That was, if I had to summarize my experience there, it was the change from paper to file. And then, that was the first wave, and then came, the use of the laptop, the internet, and of course the mobile. But that was a moment where, not that many people were using, at least in terms of architecture, schools of architecture, that kind of technology, not more than 10%. But then came a second wave that comes, up to now, and that, tells us that the use of digital technology in schools of architecture has become something much more important. Of course, now we're sharing things in the cloud. The laptop has been substituted by the tablet. I don't even want to think the amount of iPads I saw in this conference. We're wireless, well, and so on. Of course, the mail has been substituted mostly, with the social networks. How is this affecting our lives, our education? I liked, this image because from my point of view, at least in my school, this could be the image of a class. And I think somehow we are all using, machines to be connected to our school and somehow. So we all know that somehow there is a percentage of our activity, of our teaching activity that is, has gone through the digital realm. In year 2002, the perception of e-learning was negative. It was related with autodidacticism. It was related with mass distribution of knowledge, and it was negative, as I just said. But at this point, this decade, this year, I think this has changed. And e-learning is not only a sophisticated thing, but something that can deliver one-to-one, customized, that is necessary most of the times, and from my point of view, in the future, unavoidable. But what happens with schools of architecture? We all could agree that we are all digital freaks, that students are using, digital tools through, digital studios or paperless studios, that our understanding of reality of our city has a digital implication, that we all have our fab labs, so we're using very sophisticated digital tools. But again, my question here is that our skepticism about this online experience keeps making us rely on a very traditional way of understanding schools of architecture. I'm just going to give you an example. I mean, my school is a very young one, has been partnering with different schools, and just a couple of years ago, we offered a very good school of architecture, not an American one, to partner with us, in a blended program. This school is, a full-service school where digital from bottom to top. It's unbelievable digital. So we offer them, why don't you, could you help us with one module in, part of face-to-face and part online? I said, listen, we're digital, but we don't buy online. We just rely on face-to-face. From my point of view, isn't it that a contradiction? Could it be? Well, I don't know how I'm doing with time. I'm all right? 8 minutes? Okay, so I ran out of time, basically. Okay, so I'm extended time. 2 or 3 concepts that I think are important here. In 1992, education in architecture schools was either 100% face-to-face or 100% digital. Sorry, online. At this point, the great thing is that we can combine education, mixing digital and face-to-face, being very, very flexible. And why we're doing this is because this is allowing us freedom, global reach, flexibility, and it helps us to innovate, to create a sense of community that it's even stronger than the face-to-face one. I think that we all know that the digital community is a really strong one, allows us also to reach new markets and clients. Last 2 thoughts about this. There's a technological side to incorporate computers into education that is really important. You have to have a very nice interface. You have to have developed a platform which, a very sophisticated software. And you, of course, have to have a digital culture spread out, your school. But the key point here is the pedagogy. And my question here is are we, I think that all of us here are really into the digital world, in the digital realm, the digital education. Are we willing to change the pedagogy behind so the school as a whole becomes a new entity that is global, that is 24/7, that is digital, that is different, that is the school of the future? I'll leave it like this, okay? Thank you.
Thank you, Javier. Our last speaker, I have the honor of presenting Sheila Kennedy, founding principal of Kennedy and Violich Architecture Limited. Sheila Kennedy has established a new model for an interdisciplinary design practice that explores architecture, digital technology, and emerging public needs. Designated as one of the Fast Company's Masters of Design, Kennedy is described as an insightful and original thinker who's designing new ways of working, learning, leading, and innovating. She directs MAT-X, KVA's Material Research Division, which works collaboratively with industry leaders, cultural institutions, and public agencies to realize designs that advance the use of sustainable digital technologies, which has developed designs and technology applications for DuPont, Siemens, Osram, Herman Miller, Saint-Gobain, BASF, Procter & Gamble, the North Face, and the United States Department of Energy. Sheila Kennedy received her bachelor's degree from Wesleyan University, studied architecture at the École Nationale Supérieure des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and received her master's of architecture from the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University. In 1990, she founded Kennedy and Violich Architecture in partnership with Frano Violich. She was associate professor at Harvard's GSD and is currently professor of the practice of architecture at MIT. Please join me in welcoming Sheila.
Thank you, Ingalill. And thanks to all the panelists. I will wrap it up here. I guess I want to return to a moment in our organization of about 10 years ago, 2001, and the publication of this small, rather ugly book, which was entitled Material Misuse. And it's rare when you have a book that's maybe 10 years old that still is meaningful. But in putting together this talk, I wanted to emphasize a little bit what I think is still very much the central, a central question, a central problematic in the relationship between technology and architecture. And that is the material of technology, or rather its invisibility, the material interfaces of technology. How we still think, I think, about technology as if it had no materiality. So I invite you to think about the discipline and think about things like electrical plugs, think about the way in which typically construction sets are put together, where mechanical engineering is in one part of the set, electrical engineering is in another, the architecture is in another. And for a while, our work focused on really rethinking the plug, rethinking an electrical plug, rethinking how light and information could travel within materials. And of course, technology shifts material culture, but material culture also and design influences technology, how we think about it. So there was a formal set of interests, an aesthetic set of interests that guided our work. And as we moved along, we tried to radicalize that work. We tried to really think about flexible interfaces for light, for communication, for information. We thought about textiles. We liked their pliability. But conceptually, this also opened the possibility for ideas about resiliency, about ecological and socio-political resiliency as a kind of conceptual extension to physical flexibility. And that in turn led to the kind of recent set of work that we've been involved with, which has looked very explicitly at the problematics of how design can transform the materiality of distributed energy, distributed communication networks, and also engage in questioning and thinking a little bit about the relationship between technology and nature, which is probably the most current set of interests in our work. So super briefly, I'm going to touch on two aspects of our work. One has to do with the kind of embracing the kind of stasis of architecture and organizing architecture to capture a dynamic media, which is now understood as kind of natural media. And then the other set of interests, which is strongly related, is actually looking at the mobility of information and communication and portability of infrastructures. So I'll start with the idea that architecture is, of course, static, but that today the whole setup, the context, the kind of strategy of design is actually in accepting the kind of immobility of architecture and maybe beginning to kind of harness the different material effects that can be produced through infrastructures within architecture, like daylighting. This is a project that we're doing now for the anthropology department at Harvard. This is a large light well. It's like an excavation, and in this project, we're developing a wood material that is acoustic and reflective. Can also think about projects like the law school, which is a project that's just wrapping up construction in Philadelphia for University of Pennsylvania, where we really try very deliberately to take an extremely massive static material, stone, and then work with animation, set up the stone using scripting to actually play with the light. So of course the stone is static, it's immobile, but it's the light that moves. And so the project of architecture in this kind of first set of works is about setting up the circumstances to engage those medias, the dynamics of the kind of natural resources and natural media. And of course, the whole effort that goes into physicalizing a building, making all the drawings for that building, and realizing that building. I think that's very much a part of the kind of materialization of technology. The second set of projects embraces very much portability and mobility of networks and information. This is the Portable Light Project. I invite you to check it out at www.portablelight.org. And basically, this is an extremely simple material trope. We developed a module, a photovoltaic module with our partner, and it's flexible, and we realized that photovoltaics are always using one side, which is the side in which energy is produced. So our very simple idea was that we could turn the other side over and use half the real estate to manage light, to make it reflective. So we tried to use the whole of the solar panel using a kind of flat to form transformation. We can form on computer any kind of shape for a textile lantern, squash that and create a two-dimensional sewing pattern and fax that anywhere in the world where there's a fax, and that can be sewed up and integrated into a variety of different materials. So using the panel, the kind of simple idea was just using the panel to reflect light and to be part of the structure of the piece. And of course, this means that the materiality of that solar portable technology could be completely transformed. It could be transformed, and it could also be adapted to any culture. So we were really trying to challenge the idea that technology was an absolute, that it was a mono-formal enterprise, but we thought about this as kind of polyformal, polymaterial, and locally adaptable. I wanted to just update and touch on a project in Brazil, where we're working in the north of Brazil. You might think the Amazon is a kind of a remote place from seeing movies like Avatar or from our literary accounts, but it's a boom town. The Amazon is absolutely booming. There's loads of technology there. A lot of it is not good, like styrofoam refrigeration, diesel fuel, and so forth. And in our project, we're working with a number of really super partners, including Fabio Rosa and Ideas, his solar electrification organization, the electrical utility of Portugal, and also the Inter-American Development Bank, and Saudi Alegria, which is a health and communications NGO. And basically, in this project, we're taking advantage of a communications network, and we're kind of appropriating it. Because the Amazon is booming, and because Brazil is a country that's so saturated with 3G cell phone networks, there's an enormous amount of excess coverage that's actually floating on the Amazon. And for the inhabitants of the Amazon, who are not the kind of pure Amerindian that we might imagine from the news headlines, but are rather a constructed population of a variety of different groups of Amerindians who have been blended, sometimes forcefully, with Portuguese who were sent to the north. These Cabloco people, as they call themselves, have access almost by accident to the 3G network. So we're working with about 10 different communities in the state of Pará. And this is just a kind of a peek into the repurposed solar panel with its reflective exterior being used in that context. I'm going to just juxtapose this with the River First project. So this is sort of a tale of two rivers. This is a project that we won last year in Minneapolis. It's a project that we're doing with many, many partners. It's a multi-pronged project that involves architecture, urban design, product design, and also the development of a communication strategy for and about the river. Basically, we're working on a rather large stretch of about 5 miles on the upper Mississippi River that's impaired fairly significantly impaired for chloride and phosphate, so the water quality is not good. And our proposal is to extend the national park right through this industrial area, creating a kind of hybrid park where nature coexists in the city and nature and technology are materialized in such a way as to provoke a new kind of synthesis between the two. This is an existing stream water network that you can go on the internet and see, and I've just called up the last couple of weeks before today, and you can see the kind of big storm that we had passing through. So there are many digital technologies that are saturating urban areas and regions, and we appropriated the USGS Minnesota water base and incorporated it into a cell phone app that we call River Talk. This is a tool that will be used in Minneapolis public schools by the United States Parks Department and also by the Historical Society to kind of interpret the future and the past of the river. It's bringing together a kind of social network on the one hand, which is a kind of qualitative set of data, and the kind of harder data of the existing stream water monitoring system. Now, in the Amazon, mobility existed, but power and light did not. Here, power obviously exists because we're in Minneapolis, but mobility doesn't exist. So the insertion is to build a 10-mile trail system made entirely out of wood that goes up and down and negotiates its way over barges and other installations so that as people physically move up and down the river, they also have the communication tool set to work as well. I want to close on an analog problem to the one that the previous speaker brought up, which is about practice. How do we organize our own practices as architects? We've invested quite a lot in our practice, and that has led us to make some unusual decisions, decisions which sometimes we still wonder about. We need a lot of space because we do a lot of prototyping and testing, so we moved to kind of the bad side of Boston's South End, bought a building there, an old bottling plant, renovated it, and really have designed a kind of physical proximity with 2 doors, 2 large sliding doors and 2 cores that allows us to bring our kind of optoelectronic skunk works in direct connection with a kind of physical lab. We do have a lot of telepresencing and communication, but we don't find that we can be entirely digital. We don't find that we can atomize and all just kind of email in on projects. It's still, I think, very important to, in fact, I would say that the creative challenge is actually to kind of bridge the analog and the digital and to try to seek the kind of materialization that's possible of technology within materials. And so how do we organize our practice to do that? Thank you. Let's close out.
Thank you. Those were some remarkable presentations. I'd like to now invite the panel to come up here. We have about 10 minutes, which is probably better than I anticipated. So what's one of the wonderful things about being invited to put together a panel is, number one, of course, being able to contact people whose work you admire and invite them to present their work. But another thing is to find those synergies or those sort of surprising connections between the presentations, and I think that there were quite a few of them from the work that we saw. So once again, I just want to sort of throw this open, and I think instead of asking questions, actually ask you to ask questions of the panelists. And again, the panelists were asked to present work that identifies boundaries of exclusion, whether they're gender, socioeconomic, or cultural, and suggest ways in which technology can act as a transgressive medium. And so that is sort of the larger picture. And with that, maybe if somebody would like to start out with a question.
Could I? Oh, go ahead. I was going to start with a follow-up, too. Just as a provocation, of course, technology, it would be interesting, I think, to hear everyone's thoughts on not only how technology kind of infects architecture, but how that can be flipped around. In other words, how design is a very powerful agent that actually shapes technology. Because I think we perhaps have not looked at that side of the coin enough.
That was a bold, that way.
It was.
Get a hand.
I think my question starts with, I think, what Hansy was saying about the use of social technologies to sort of generate momentum behind projects, which, and she brought up the issue of Kickstarter as a way of funding a project. And I think some of these other projects that are also research-based, and I want to maybe ask a little bit about where funding and sort of ability to do this kind of research, because a lot of it is sort of proactive, comes from, and how do you negotiate that as part of practice?
Hansy?
Yeah.
So basically, where do you find the funds to have a practice where you can deal with research, or let's say, how do you do work without a client per se? How do you build momentum? I think, although, I mean, using social, with the hammock, it was completely thought of, invented, everything was done completely through social media. What was amazing about that project was that the community, the people, were the individuals that actually funded a design project, which I thought was really different and extraordinary. At the end, I had 61 backers, which were people I didn't know, and majority of them were $5 to $10 donations. I've also found with the starting of Brace as a charitable organization, it attempts to tackle as some of the problems that I had doing everything through social media, which dealt with the limits of that kind of resource. So, for example, I'm sure you can fund a large amount of projects, but I was only able to find let's say, $8,000 of the project cost, which ultimately was about $18,000. With the charitable organization, it has actually opened up more resource to be able to apply for actual grants that support research. And so for us, I think in terms of new modes of practice, it's been interesting for us to have a for-profit and a nonprofit, let's say, doing what we love to do, which is to do design. I think that's a really interesting model when you don't have the client that will actually sponsor creative work, or you don't have an institution when you have limited resource. But the amazing thing about the social media is that it can sponsor any individual doing creative work.
Comment about pedagogy. It's interesting, I think Javier brought it up that perhaps we need to rethink or reinvent pedagogy to respond to some of these things. And it's interesting that, refreshing maybe, that really none of the presentations really focused on the notion that digital fab labs are in some ways the answer that, you know, architectural education has for technology, and it's so prevalent now in education, and it tends to be very much about formal manipulations. And I'm wondering, you know, with all of your presentations, really, they were about focusing on ways of working and methodologies, and I guess it's a question about pedagogy. Do we have the right kinds of pedagogy to teach some of these things, or how do we address that?
You know, in looking at all of the presenters, the one concept or idea that came to mind was technology addiction. And the idea that we're contaminating, there's a kind of contamination that goes on with the cultures that we're engaging, where you present a technology, but it eclipses an indigenous technology that might be actually equivalent, better, or good. And we could take that to South America, we can take it to other places, but we can also take it right into our studios. And I find things like these handicaps that are coming up. Like, we ask students to put plans on top of each other at the same scale. They do not know scale. It's not possible. Or how laser cutting has completely handicapped students. There's a kind of atrophy, entropy, hypertrophy of the ability to cut or perform. And so at one level, what's happening is an exchange. And I wonder what we're exchanging, and this gives me pause, exactly as you're saying. You know, there's like, we're not thinking this enough. Yeah?
Well, I think we. No. I mean, I think it's better to incorporate more.
Okay, although I think that's a really, it's a great question, and
Okay.
because everybody here teaches, I'd love to hear,
Yeah.
I mean, Sheila, I think Eric, I mean, everybody here is an instructor.
Well,
How do you bring this thinking or the methodology, not the forms, but the methodology into the classroom, in the studio process, for example?
Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, I think we're in a transitional period. We still don't know what is going to be the end of this. Definitely, we're more in an immigrant phase than a native, following Pritzker's terms. But I don't know. I mean, my concern is that my feeling is that we tend to use digital technology, even though in a very avant-garde way, because what we're producing and what I've seen today, it's beautiful works, really beautiful work. But I mean, overall, as I said, it seems to me that the scheme or the concept of pedagogy is still the same. So I think there's not an answer yet to that. But probably, when you did, all of you used, this amazing works. You have conclusions about is this different if we did it without any technology? I mean, that's the question. It's I don't have an answer for that. Sorry.
I was just going to say, can I just respond? I was just going to say that when we were doing this project, the time zone project, it became very clear that the mirror was two-way, and that any government buying these prototypes and installing them would also have access then to the public and the surveillance in a way that they otherwise wouldn't. And this, in a strange way, came up also in our school, where we're trying to extend experiences through cameras and through technologies to other places, so students can be on one campus and another campus and not miss a lecturer who comes in and is just in one place. And at the same time, those cameras and the exact same equipment that would be used to enhance the pedagogy are also being discussed as ways to kind of manage and monitor potentially those studios, those spaces when there isn't a. So I think there's a very interesting kind of line between surveillance in this one way of thinking about technology. And I'm just thinking about this way that I'm interested in terms of bringing people together in social change. It can also be, I think, for very kind of socially oppressive, used for socially oppressive modes as well.
Three of the presenters established a certain link between North and South within their work, their research work, and I found that interesting because technology obviously allowed for bridging those geographical gaps, right, and integrate different distant societies within a collaborative work. However, there seems to be always, the so-called first world kind of like projecting the technology into the second world or third, or whichever is called these days. But I'm more interested in the reverse lessons when these technologies kind of apply unidirectionally and what happens in reverse. I think Jon briefly touched on some of this, and I would like to know from the other presenters who have these connections with the South, what kind of lessons were incorporated into their learning process and the future interventions. Also, I'm interested in knowing how you visualize how technology in some of these societies that have less access of high tech and low tech, perhaps, have found a way to activate public space. We have seen that in the Arab Spring, for example, right, which is actually imitated after in the U.S. with the Occupy movement, but you can trace back a lot of that earlier with the anti-globalization, etc. But there's always this kind of like reverse lessons that I'm interested in knowing more about.
Sure. I think Hansy addressed that perhaps most explicitly, but I think that I would say that, for example, what we have done is we've created a very simple kit that's a tool, and that kit is a shapeshifter. It can be slipped into any flexible material, and it can be fabricated in fairly simple ways. And we sort of had to ask ourselves the question to kind of really make it affordable, what good is a little bit of power, or how can we leverage an increment of power to kind of have the maximum impact? And so lighting, because that can be done, and also connectivity through a USB charging. So for example, in the case of the Cabloco in the Amazon, it's really pretty significant because really in the last couple of years, for the very first time, there is a sector of public space that has been activated by the people who actually live in the Amazon, which is very rare. Generally, we have intermediary people come in like Sigourney Weaver or whoever, and James Cameron, and they will come and visit and then tell the world, what it was like. So there's always a kind of interlocutor. So I do think that there is a fairly well chronicled, unprecedented technology shift that has to do with cellular communications and the various different ways in which those are kind of hacked, appropriated, and used. And of course, that area is growing the largest in the South and also in the East, in Asia, Africa, South America is by far the biggest contributor to the global cell phone network.
Sure. When I visited the YU and the Wahira, I learned so much, and it gave me a different perspective. Like, I learned so much about architecture there. What I found really fascinating is that their rituals, weaving is so important in their life that they actually wove everything that they wore to buildings of their structure, to even the way that they moved around the city was a woven pattern. And what I found, and this gets back to the previous questions in terms of pedagogy and education, I found that technology, to the way that I define it and the way that I see it being defined in South America, is literally tools and techniques to allow one to solve problems. So pedagogically, that's what I try to teach my students, and this is what I borrowed from that community in ways in which they were using literally their structure as a loom to weave their screens, their furniture. And so when I was given a very limited amount of budget, that completely removed boundaries. You know, here technology, we have building technology, envelope technology, digital technology. I mean, it goes on. But there, I learned that we shouldn't have boundaries. And when I was given a limited budget, I tried to reduce all the excess. And that's what I had kind of learned from that community. Another really amazing thing that I learned was that they only sleep in the room was separate, their kitchen was separate, but the ways in which it was built was completely communal. You know, that you are living within each other, and you only sleep in that room. And here in the U.S., it just made a lot of sense why we're not social. Everything is so enclosed, and why? But anyway, so that's my response.
I had a thought about that. Last year, Toshiko Mori at the GSD taught a studio which was for sites in Africa. And the students were trying to sort of, they traveled to Africa, they visited tribal people, they sort of tried to figure out what they could do in that context, sort of working globally, working locally. And then the students came back and they tried to sort of develop design projects that sort of would intervene in a context like that. I was on the review and I was sitting next to Andres Lepek from MoMA, who did the show Small Design, Big Change. And project after project, I was struck by the fact that working in a context with limited resources, the students were trying to find ways to innovate with material, with aggregation, with assembly. And each one looked kind of like the PS1 projects. You know, they looked like finding ways to be sort of clever with limited means to produce structures, to produce weavings, you know. And I was struck by that, and I was like, what is it about? And maybe it's just that it's the same people that are doing both. But I also thought, you know, there's something about PS1 where the constraints imposed by the budget force a kind of innovation. And I thought, well, maybe that's not a kind of, it's not about sort of exporting high tech. It's about learning sort of techniques and using constraints to become innovative, regardless of the context, or east-west or north-south. And I thought that was kind of interesting. Our use of technology in our office, we do not fetishize it, although it may look that way. You know, we look at it as an extension. It's a prosthetic. It's something that we can incorporate. And like I said, we ingest it. We don't celebrate it. It's just become part of the process. And in a way, we're kind of tired of talking about digital tools. You know, they've become so ubiquitous. The students have absorbed it. You know, we don't have to tell them to go to the laser cutter. They're already there. My point is that when you make tools, you can make tools to make tools. You know, you can do analog tools. You know, you can design something in the machine shop to attach to your robot to help you make something else. You know, and that's what I would like to see, is a kind of hybrid between using the lathe and the robot. You know, and in fact, in order to achieve what you want to do, you sort of need to do both. You need to make the tool to help the tool to make the next tool to make something else.
Well, my question here is, what's the price we're paying for this? I mean, everything seems so fluid and easy, and we're just accepting this as a necessary good, and I want to know what the points of resistance are, and like, I can't handwrite anymore. I'm looking over here at John's writing, it's so good, and I can't read my own. So what's at stake in this? What are the bigger questions here?
Well, just kind of picking up on both those points, I think that one of the areas of resistance is material resistance. I think that the issue, the primary issue, I would imagine in pedagogy, though, confession, I'm not really a teacher, I'm a practitioner, it has to be materialization. It's not digitization. It's the rendering material of what has been designed digitally. And it's no coincidence that this problematic of materialization is occurring just when the United States is facing this big problem with manufacturing. You know, we've completely forgotten how to manufacture, how to make the simplest things, and so forth. So I think that all of these bridging tools that Eric is referring to are absolutely essential. What we have tried to do is to say, how do we bring this into practice? How do we physically organize the space of practice to be able to accommodate this materialization? And I think that it would be fascinating to really look at the typology of the architecture school and to try to rethink the physical design of the architecture school so we don't have the segregations that typically occur of workshop, which is either a different part of different building on campus, or that room down in the basement that's separate from studio and so forth, and try to think of a way to kind of atomize the various different analog and digital tools that are necessary to achieve this kind of rematerialization and a kind of common industrial or manufacturing or material knowledge that would really revitalize this country.
We're running out of time here, but I'd love to sit here for the rest of the afternoon.
Extremely interesting series of very diverse presentations, and I'd like to propose a kind of a question that connects to what Sheila was saying in terms of materials, and connect it to the social arguments that were the arguments about the social that were made before, in terms of the use of technology to craft or to create sort of movements of people and social networks. The one question that comes to my mind is, in many of these cases, technology was used, let's say, for other purposes than itself. And to me, there is a kind of a question, when we look at all our own questions, let's say, which is, what is the ultimate purpose? Perhaps Paulette was trying to allude to that. Where is the other? Where is the self? Where is the relation that exists between the conspicuous presence of this beautiful or horrific, objects, cyborgs or zombies, in relation to the tools that people use, and at the end to is to what end or to what purpose the logic in the students in this quest, in this question. Where is the other? It's an open question. What do you think?
Does anybody want to take that one on?
You should.
Or is that a good place to summarize the conversation?
So, yeah, I think that's a really great place to end, and I think Paulette's question about, where does it all end, and what does it really mean in the end, this sort of the digitization of our discipline. But I want to thank very much for the panelists for their beautiful presentations, and thank you all very much for joining us. So.